Okay, on the show today, Thomas Hübl. So we got him. Years of trying. This man is popular. He's hard to get hold of. I guess he's most known for his work around collective trauma, intergenerational trauma, and bringing together trauma and spirituality. He's just got a new book out, which I just had a good read of, so I'm sure we'll talk about that. He's a level 9 Dungeons and Dragons trauma mage. That's what I've heard on the grapevine. So, Thomas, welcome.
Thank you. That's a great summary of Thomas. Thanks. Yeah, I'm happy to be here.
Let's hear a little bit about your life before we go into the content. Like, how did you get interested in what you do now?
That's a good question. I think it started already in an orchestrated way. It started that when I was 16, I felt drawn to volunteer as a paramedic. So I became a paramedic also then later while I studied. And so I think that like this was 9 years of working for the Red Cross as a paramedic and also training paramedics. And so I think that taught me a lot about trauma without at that time knowing what I was getting myself into. And but I was deeply like you, I was exposed to a lot of trauma, obviously, but I was also, it taught me a lot about society, the world, different levels of society, how, you see basically you're kind of intimate with many, many levels of life. And then, and then I was on a 4-year meditation retreat when I left my medical studies and I was 4 years meditating. That was another training, but a very different training. And then when I started to run groups and the groups grew pretty quickly, so then I begin to see and surface this collective trauma. Especially we started to work in the German speaking area of Europe, and then it expanded into the world, into the Middle East and other parts of the world. And so collective trauma showed up in my groups regularly as group processes in large groups. So, and the more I studied it, the more I learned about the trauma is not just an individual experience or an individual suffering, but trauma is also like a systemic suffering. It's a systemic issue. And so then I focused more and more on that. And the last 20 years, I did a lot of that.
Yeah, let's get those basic distinctions. So a lot of listeners will have some kind of trauma knowledge. They probably know Peter Levine, Stephen Porges. Idea of intergenerational, and so individual, intergenerational, and collective trauma. Maybe say a little bit about that distinction.
Now, individual trauma means if an individual in their biography goes through a very overwhelming experience that we cannot compute, the trauma response kicks in, and the trauma response is actually an intelligent function that is kind of protecting us to survive better. So often we think about the trauma as something like a limitation or like it's kind of a weakness, but actually it's a strength, the trauma response, not the experience we go through. And and so if that happens in a person's life, so we call it individual trauma, or we call it attachment trauma, or shock trauma, or war trauma. But it's something that's connected to my experience. But the intergenerational trauma means, and I have seen a lot of it, is that when our parents, grandparents, great grandparents, and so on went through traumatic experiences like wars or slavery or genocides or whatever, dictatorships. So the trauma is being passed on through multiple systems and ways. And we might have symptoms in our life that we cannot connect to a biographical event, but we still experience those symptoms. And some people say, yeah, but it doesn't fit because I didn't experience like a big trauma and still I know those symptoms. And then when I studied more systemic trauma, so all the relationships and all the societal functions that we create are partly built on integrated processes that are emergent, they update themselves, they are kind of developing. But also a big part of our society is built on trauma-based relationships that are non-emergent. They are repetitive. It's like the repetition compulsion of trauma. We see this in the triggers, in the polarization, in the fragmentation, in the othering in society. And so part of our society, we treat it as if that was life happening now. And I would say no. If we make a bigger, if you look at it clearer, so we see there are actually two different types of processes. And the ones that we struggle with, they are non-emergent, they are disrelated, they are hurt. And I think it would be great if we call that hurt, that are the systems, the societies, but also organizations, companies, movements carry some of those systemic trauma aspects inside, and that trauma is an accumulation of a lot of historical events that happened in societies. And I think if we open the map, individual, ancestral, and collective, we can begin to kind of treat the trauma that we need to treat on the level that we need to address. So we have a much wider range. And for me, this feels much more appropriate, especially also in this time.
We'll definitely come to the sort of times we're in. So we have our own personal traumas, something overwhelming happened, but we're also carrying this traumas of the groups, like, my family are Irish and there's plenty there. Yeah, plenty there,
Right.
There's plenty going on. And there's a particular kind of music, and if it gets played, I just want to like run across green fields and kill English people. And then, like, as soon as I hear this kind of music, and I go, I am English. What the fuck is that? I'm second generation immigrant, but something's being enacted or going on that isn't mine. And it has a kind of non-individual feel. And then there's another way we're holding the pain of the world, right? Like when things are going on globally, and it's not just that we see it on the news, it's more than that. And when things are going on globally, it's not there, it's here as well. Is that kind of what you said?
Yes, that's what I say. And also that we sometimes think that I believe we think our nervous system too individual. So it looks like the nervous system that you can see in the anatomical structure of the brain and the spine and the nervous system, that's just me. And I would say, no, I think we also have like our nervous system, and we're just not able to measure it yet fully, but that our nervous system is also collective. And so we are all plugged into like a collective data pool, like a supercomputer. And the more trauma we carry, that supercomputer is more fragmented. So we feel more separate from nature. We say, oh, there are humans and there is nature. As if, when you walk through the forest, where is nature?
Yeah.
It's not just around you, it's through you, because I am also nature. Like, what's the difference between the rabbit and Thomas? It's like, yeah, of course, there's a bit of a difference. And at the same time, my body is as much nature as the rabbits or the tree. Or so that we see, wow, we learned through trauma, we feel more separate. That's why many feedback loops that keep biological or living systems intelligence are broken down, and then we feel more isolated. And I think on top of that isolation, we also created schools of thought that are more separate. So we treat life sometimes like a mechanical structure versus like a real data pool, a data network.
So in terms of healing individual trauma, people may have heard of somatic experiencing or TRE or whatever. How do we heal collective trauma? This is another kettle of fish. So how do you work with that?
Yeah, I think first of all, there is an awareness, first of all, to create an awareness that there is something like, because it's so much invisible, because we all grew up in it, that we normalized collective trauma to a certain extent. So we need to open our eyes a bit and say, oh, wow, yeah, I wonder about this, I wonder about that, I wonder about some political conversations, about social issues, criminality rates, like racism. There are many things that are part of the trauma field that it seems like is part of our life, but it's actually much more. There's much more hidden underneath. So once we acknowledge that, then we can say, okay, for certain people, the treatment of trauma is definitely in one-on-one treatments with skilled trauma therapists, and that's what they need. But For our social sphere, I think we need to create, first of all, we need to heal collective trauma in collectives, which means large groups that through their relational capacity create safe spaces. And I believe when we create enough safe space, the trauma in the group will naturally surface. At least that's my experience. When we build a container well, then stuff surfaces naturally. We don't need to induce it because it wants to detox itself. The past wants to detox itself. And then we create the right titration and the right facilitation, how to portion by portion integrate and learn. So post-traumatic learning comes through integrating trauma and flourishing more and learning something from it. And so the answer on the one hand is larger groups are containers when they are well built. So then we can heal portions of the systemic trauma. And on a bigger scale, I would say, this is the time for a new invention. And the new invention, like we invented in history somewhere on the way, hospitals emerged. And we thought, oh, hospital is a great idea. And so we developed that further. And I believe we need not a hospital, but we need a new structure for the legacies of nations. As you said, Britain or Ireland or the United States or Germany or the Middle East, or you name it, the whole colonial trauma ring around the world. Like, we need a process that's built into the mainstream society that are holding spaces to deal with the legacy, because I would say we know too much about trauma and collective trauma to not have that. It's not anymore responsible to not have a structure that deals with that stuff. So we need to invest in that as societies. And I think if governments took that on and we developed such a holding space, we can prevent so many other things. The healthcare costs would drop, criminal rates would drop, social issues would slowly start to disappear, because the capacity of the society would actually grow, and we would learn and upgrade our skills and our, let's say, societal maturity, which often trauma healing leads to more personal maturity, more relational maturity, and more societal maturity.
Yeah, I think in my company, there's a sense of trying to heal the rift between Germans and English with a lot of immature humor. And we reflect it very much. But there does, sort of, jokes aside, there does seem to be this urge to heal. And it's very good natured. My company's sort of almost 50% German. And as someone with ADHD, I highly recommend having Germans in charge of your life. And there's always these sort of good-natured jokes that go between me and Daniela, or me and Alina, who, she's in Cologne. And it seems like something's trying to heal, and it's not too raw. It's at a level which is friendly and appropriate. And equally, I know when something's sort of just buried, it doesn't really work. Like if we just try and pretend it's not happening, or that the history hasn't happened, or the future doesn't want to happen, it comes out sideways in all kinds of weird ways, right? Being born to repeat it. It's like they're code about history. Those who study history are kind of doomed to see it happen anyway and be repeated. It seems like this is the main reason to look at this stuff and get it out in the open, is otherwise it would just keep repeating itself in spirals.
That's exactly what we are seeing. And we are seeing it right now in the world. We see it in the Middle East, we see it in Europe, and we see it in other places. And I think you're very right. And it's so easy. Let's say after the Second World War, had we created spaces after some time of rebuilding, because at the first phase we need to take care of the existential needs. We all know that, of course. But then there was a phase in Europe where that was the ideal time to create an architecture to integrate the Second World War and actually create more flourishing for Europe, a more unified Europe. And also the former East-West split, we worked on this also in some of the groups. There was so much potential to actually integrate that more. And I think that's just an example now, but as you said, we have to pay attention when it's not a crisis. And it's so easy not to use that time to really work on that stuff. And then once we have a crisis or another war, we say, oh, wow, how could that happen? But we were missing the time. We spent the time on entertainment or other stuff versus creating space to integrate that. And how many of the parents or grandparents of people in Europe were affected, were in the war and carry the wounds of the war and transmit it psychologically, epigenetically, socially to the next generation. And as you said, also between the nations. And if creating more holding spaces is absolutely needed, I'm sure, because otherwise we are complicit in the repetition compulsion.
I see it coming out in other ways. Like I was in Berlin and I noticed loads of Israelis had moved to Berlin. And when my friend's one of them, and I said to him, I said, well, you moved to Berlin, what's going on? He said, the rent's cheap. We gave some practical reason. And I was like, yeah, there's cheap rent in a lot of places. You go to Budapest, you go anywhere. Like, and he's like, my grandmother thinks I'm insane and she says I shouldn't move here. And I'm like, something's trying to happen there, That doesn't seem a coincidence to me that Berlin has suddenly had all this influx of Israelis.
That's right. I absolutely think it's right. And I think that there is, because I often say when in trauma, between transgressor and transgressed, there is an entanglement. There's a trauma entanglement. And that trauma entanglement will show up over the generations because some healing needs to happen. And I think you're spot on. There is something happening there in Berlin. I also saw that. And I think that's actually a great attempt of life to heal the past, and it calls people, and whatever are the practical reasons, but fact is there is some process happening, and if we
Happening.
support that, yeah, then it will
It's
be
bubbling up. The other thing I noticed in Berlin is it was pretty hostile as a man. I'm kind of a guy's guy in some way, and I found it pretty hostile. I was like, this is the place I feel least welcome as a man. And I didn't understand it. And then I talked to one of my friends there, Lan Stefani, who's amazing actually. And she was like, do you know the history of Berlin? And I read it, and the entire city suffered like huge sexual violence at the hands of the Soviets. And I was like, oh, I didn't think it was personal. This isn't about me.
mm,
This is about what happened, not even to someone's grandmother, just what happened in the same place
mm.
someone was in. Like there's a feeling there. And it seems your work addresses this sort of subtle level of feeling. I'm gonna be honest with you, Thomas. Sometimes I'm looking at your stuff and I'm thinking, I think this is some hippie bullshit. I don't get it. And then I feel like sometimes I'm looking, I go, this is too out there for me. But other times I have these experiences. I'm like, no, there's something in it. There's definitely something in it. So yeah, how is it addressing these more like subtle, embodied, kind of almost spiritual aspects?
Yeah, I don't know if they're so subtle. I mean, some of them are subtle, but some of them, when you go to certain places, let's say like the example of Germany, but also in Austria, where I'm from. So let's because the similar sexual violence happened there and similar bombings happened there. So when you look at certain places, you can really feel like almost like as if you're suffocating. It feels heavy. It feels like you're happy when you can leave. And
Yes.
and I think many of us, I think many of us that are listening right now know this somehow in some places. And so there is a memory, or even when you look at trauma, when you carry a trauma and you go to your parents' house and then you feel you're happy that you can go out again, that shows that the trauma is still active in you and it's connected to a location where trauma happened. And when once you heal it, you see, oh, you become more free. And I think we all know that there is that information, the trauma information doesn't disappear, not not even with the generation that experienced it. So once that generation passes away, the trauma information stays still in the system because it's an unfinished, circular, repetitive process. And I think it stays in the collective subconscious until it's being reintegrated somehow. And either that happened through many generations of individual suffering or individual symptoms, or it happened through another crisis that some of that energy tries to discharge itself, or it happened through consciousness and like volunteering to say, as citizens, we have the responsibility to clean up the living room. And it doesn't matter who messed up the living room, we need to clean it up. That's the point. And then we have more freedom in our life. And so I think we see this on all these levels. If you don't take care of your personal trauma history or attachment traumas, you'll re-experience it through many intimate relationships, maybe. And the same is true for cultures.
Do you think we're able to do that? So the good news is, in the 20 years I've been interested in trauma, it's become way more mainstream. Actually, one of my friends yesterday, I said I was interviewing him. He said, he's part of the trauma industrial complex was the joke. And he doesn't have anything against you particularly. He's just saying it's like this big industry, the big trauma names. The hardest people to get on the podcast because it's big business. But things are much more mainstream. But then I also see, if you look at the history of trauma, there's always a forgetting. So they'll call it combat stress, and then they'll be forgetting. Then they'll call it PTSD, there'll be a forgetting. And maybe Israel is unique in that because it kind of has an infrastructure, but it has a history of conflict, unlike, say, Congo that doesn't have the university structure or something like that. But we have this habit of sort of pushing it back under the carpet and not wanting to talk about it. And can we get to the point of it being institutionalized in the same way as I go to my GP and he gives me antibiotics and it's kind of normal part of the society? Or like, do you think we can get there, or do you think it's something that we're just going to keep pushing down?
No, I think we keep pushing it down, and we need the skill to work with the intelligence of keep pushing it down. I think if we make that mechanism our ally, it's not gonna run us. But if we try to get rid of that mechanism, it's gonna run us. And so the defense mechanism against the pain that is stored in the trauma, because like many people that say, oh, this is my trauma, what they're actually saying is these are my trauma symptoms, because the trauma itself is somewhere buried in the unconscious, and the symptoms that people feel as triggers or all kinds of physical symptoms, they're just the effect of the trauma. But the trauma location is kind of buried somewhere until we bring it up into our awareness. And I think that's the defense mechanisms are intelligent. This is the best that the individual or the society could do in the given circumstances. And so if I know that as a child, like disembodying myself, or any kind of child that went through a trauma and developed a defense mechanism, that defense mechanism looks a bit like a limitation today, but it actually was the most intelligent function in that ecosystemic environment. And the same, I believe, is true for the collective defense mechanisms. Every time we worked with large groups on the Holocaust trauma, we could feel that when we go deeper, before something comes up, we hit this collective denial. And once we notice, we were willing to be in the symptoms of the heaviness and all the feelings that come up when you touch that denial, and we own it, then a release can happen. And I think learning how to work with the defenses as our friends, not as the obstacles that we meet. And then I think, yes, we can establish a structure, because we will take that which prevents it as our friend with us versus working against us, against it. And then it seems like it works against us. And I think that's skill we need.
Yeah, it's the kind of trauma Aikido move. I think it was my friend Miles Kessler actually in Tel Aviv who first kind of mentioned
Yeah, I
you.
know, Miles.
Shout
Yeah.
out to Miles, he's a old Aikido brother, good friend. But okay, so in the modern culture, there seems to be an understanding that trauma can happen in groups. But what I see developing is that's highly politicized. So it's sort of, I'm from the more conservative side of the street, and my side of the street doesn't feel welcome at the party. Like, absolutely not. And we're 90% of the world and 50% of the West. And the other piece there is certain groups have their trauma acknowledged. Like I've been to Yad Vashem, for example, the Holocaust Museum when I was 15 years old, and it left a huge impression on me. And, like I'm very aware of some Jewish trauma as a thing. We used to actually, when I taught coaches in Tel Aviv, I used to set a timer and see how long it would take till the Holocaust came up. Because as soon as you start working with the body, it's no more than 3 hours till you're talking about the
Mhm.
Holocaust as soon as you enter the body in any, even if you're doing coaching, something totally different.
Mhm.
So certain groups seem to be aware of it, or society acknowledges there was a slave trade for certain groups of people. But actually, there was a slave trade for everyone. Like every group of people had a slave trade. The Irish were enslaved, the English were enslaved by Barbary pirates, the Germans were enslaved, the Slavs are literally named after slaves. That's where the word slave comes from. They were the slaves of the Roman Empire. Yet certain groups seem to be putting in a monopoly on it, or there's an emphasis that certain groups are more traumatized than others, and that creates a hierarchy. And what I see done with that hierarchy is not very pretty, that certain groups have more trauma than others. It becomes a way to be powerful, to be abusive, to get some kind of revenge, maybe, is kind of how I see it. So, how do we talk about group trauma in a way that's more skillful than simply having a hierarchy of who gets to abuse who now?
Right. First of all, I think what you just described, it's very important that we see that happening. There's like a hierarchy of trauma and who has the most severe trauma, and it became like a cultural currency. And but when we look a bit deeper, we see that trauma always comes with a sense of scarcity. So when trauma is in the mix, something is not enough. So there was not enough protection for the child. There was not enough love. There was not enough whatever. There was not enough something, attunement, not enough being seen. And or there was not enough protection for a group in society or whatever it was. And so once we open the the box of trauma in our world, the first thing we will get is the vacuum of attention. So there is like a vacuum that sucks all the attention to it. And then when many groups do that, as it's happening now in the world, like the more we look at that, like it gets sucked over there. It gets sucked over there because so many boxes are being opened up now. And in all of them, I believe there is a truth, but we need to be very aware which mature self holds that truth as a conscious process. And if not, then we get sucked into the unconscious elements of that vacuum or of that scarcity. And then it seems like we are fighting over resources. But once we make the space bigger and say, yes, that's true, but that's a symptom on the way. That's not how it is. That's a symptom on the way that is asking for a recognition of that which hasn't been seen, or the missing witness that sees something is going on and hasn't been stopped, either for an individual or for a group or a part of the population. And I think if we can hold that as a phase that we are in right now and not make it as this is the thing, but this is like when you take a client through a process, you don't take every station as the thing. You see, okay, there are symptoms speaking, there are defenses speaking, there's this, until you get to like a healing process. And I think we need to go through this phase, not be too distracted by all the distractions it creates, and stay focused on the healing and take it deeper until we feel actually that we are much more resourced than it seems in the first place. We can deal with it, but we need to go through that phase. You're right. And the unconscious version of that is that we all start fighting over who is more hurt and who, and then it becomes just a messy process. But there is a lot of pain in the world that is unrecognized. And I think when we come from a lack and we are confronted with a lack, the lack is just getting bigger, and we don't often feel we have enough to give. So then it's like we feel the vacuum.
There's that scarcity, and I like this idea of a stage. I was working with people pleasing, and I say like they often go for a slightly obnoxious stage, and saying that with a smile, not too much blame, and but that can last a couple of years, and it can cause a lot of hurt. And I don't see acknowledgement that traumatized people can be real assholes, and yes, it can be coming from pain, and of course, people do the best they can, but it's pretty dangerous. I don't think it's enough just to say this is a stage we'll pass through. Um, I see some serious dangers around that.
No, that's what I meant. Like when it doesn't mean that we will accept every kind of behavior, that we don't set clear boundaries and in certain moments where they need to be set, or that we protect other people that are being affected by the follow-up trauma that's being created. I'm not saying that we don't do that. What I'm saying is that we are in a phase that we need to handle, I think, with more skill than it's often handled, because what that creates is reactivity, and that reactivity tries to deal with that behavior, and that's often like a mutually regressive process. And I think we need a higher maturity to hold it, and also to take some leadership. I mean, it needs also some leadership sometimes to guide that energy into something new. And I think everybody who has some skills to do that, most probably, like many people that are listening now, are called to be part of that new collective leadership.
Mm. You know, I feel that reactivity in myself. I can feel it now, so I'm aware of that, and it's like, yeah, let's move on. Let's go really broad. Why is everyone crazy now? Like every guest I have on, I've asked a similar question to, and I hear different answers, you know, from historical perspectives. I mean, there's always been wars, there's always been difficulties in the world, but it seems like the mental health of the West, particularly, I can't speak for Asia or Africa, is particularly bad right now. And, you know, I've been in 10 countries this year, and everywhere people are nuts in Europe. Why? Why all of a sudden are we so crazy? It's not like things suddenly got worse.
No, I think there are two things. It's not that things suddenly got worse, but I think we have like different influences. One is that I think democracies are going through a detox phase. And I often say, like as a skilled group facilitator, you know that groups develop or evolve in waves. So you have a wave where you come to a new level of safety and kind of togetherness and relationality, and then boom, something happens and it looks like, oh, there's a disruption. But the disruption is actually good. Some people think, oh, something went wrong, and some people would say no, but the disruption is a new level of detox because we developed a new level of safety before. So then more can come up to be integrated to evolve the group even to a higher level. And then maybe this might happen again. So I think we see that autocratic or dictatorship-based societies are much less safe than democracies. And so in democracies, there will be waves of detox phases. All kinds of stuff will come up. I think with good leadership, and the question is if we have that leadership, but with good leadership, we can actually go through those phases and develop the societal or democratic process. So that's one thing. The other thing is we are living in a time where I think we don't understand yet how much the ecological stress buffers are full. That the climate change and the whole change in our biosphere and the loss of biodiversity that's happening, I think creates a lot of stress that doesn't show up yet in such extreme. I mean, it shows up in some places already pretty extreme, but it's not enough to shake mainstream society out of the habitual way of looking at the world. And so there is still like a bit of a denial going on how stressed our biosphere is, but my body is biosphere. I think it's very important to see this. There's more stress on us than we recognize. And then a third, I think, very important function is also that the data that we use right now to communicate is getting faster while we are having this conversation.
Yeah.
So there's a constant, like it's like a train that accelerates all the time. So you don't feel the acceleration so strongly. But after some time, you notice that you're going with 300 kilometers per hour. And so when the data stream of life goes through our nervous systems, and it's getting faster and faster, our nervous systems need to deal with that upgrade of data speed. And I think that brings out a lot of trauma that cannot do that. Like the trauma doesn't want to be updated. Trauma wants to be frozen. When the train gets faster and we cannot let the wind go through, it feels like a stagnation. And then all this stuff comes out. And I think just these three, and maybe we could mention more factors, but just these three factors are some main impacts that each of them alone is already challenging. But if they come together, I think we see what we see now. And that's why that's a very good question. How do we deal with that? That's a very good question.
I've been trying a few of your meditations and actually enjoying them. And one I really like is just this idea of digestion. Like often when I sit to meditate, I used to be doing a technique like breath counting or metta or something. And now, my life's moving pretty quickly. The world's moving pretty quickly. And often when I sit down, I'm just like, fucking hell. I'm just like catching up with myself.
Right.
What just happened in the last 24 hours of
Right.
life? And I think I independently call it digestion meditation, but it sounds like you have the same concept. And like that just, it's like catching up with everything going on in the personal and collective system seems to be like part of keeping sane, right?
Absolutely. And I think that's actually a skill to live in this time or to be part of the world right now. I think needs that skill that we are. Look at COVID. I mean, the world went through 2 years of crazy crisis. However, whatever you might think about it, but there was a crisis. So many people lost people, like relatives, lost friends, lost their jobs, lost many things. And then, of course, there was the benefit of slowing down and having more time. But on the other hand, there was also a crazy disruption. And how many places do you see where we say, okay, let's stop for a moment? Like we
We
went
haven't
through
processed
crisis.
that yet, have we,
Yeah,
right? Like I
yeah,
got
what
stuff I
was
want to
that?
talk about. Like,
Right. And
but we
instead
haven't
of it,
processed it.
nothing happened, just move on.
La
And
la la.
but
Yeah.
that's what we are doing. And that's I think why we didn't digest a lot of the trauma of much bigger events like the Second World War or 400 years of slavery and racism, because we don't have a culture of stopping. And that's why, like what you just said about having an individual practice, just 5 or 10 minutes a day to digest what's happening and let those emotions, let the stress, let the thoughts just flow through and digest them. I think that's as important as taking a shower or washing yourself. Like it's an inner wash that keeps your nervous system fresh and refreshed. It's like you refresh the browser. So I think that's very on what you just said.
Turn it off and on again. Um, let's talk about attunement. This is, I just read your book on this, and there's one phrase that kept jumping out at me. My friend Alexander Vilvoskaya, who studied with you, talked about this as well, which was the feeling of being felt as a key thing. So it's kind of a bit confusing in English. Like, I didn't know if I say it right. What is that? Like the feeling of being felt. It's like, I see you seeing me kind of thing, right? Like Thomas looks like he's paying attention in a way that's pretty sympathetic. Like, is that what you mean? Like, what is that? Let's start there.
Yeah, no, like I think it happens on a deeper level. It happens on that when I'm let's say connected and I feel connected to my body and my nervous system feels quite regulated, so I'm not very triggered or stressed. So then I feel you. So when we sit here and I have a felt sense of you, and you have and I pay attention to your attention. So where is your attention? And if you are aware of me, if you feel me, or if you don't feel me, if you're more busy in yourself, or if, I don't know, your attention is scattered all over, your attention is more concentrated, you are more resonant. We feel resonances in relationships. And I think since we all grew up, because that's a very important function of attachment, we are very aware of our parents' attention, and I think the same part of our nervous system is if it hasn't been hurt, then we are still aware of connection. And we also feel when when you sit with a friend and you tell him your deepest problem, and the friend there is constantly on the phone, so you will feel less safe and less motivated to share your deepest feelings than if somebody is with you, listens to you, you feel the person's resonance, you feel the person's compassion. We feel a lot of things. And I think so that I feel you feeling me is much more common and much more kind of implemented in us anyway, and just making that explicit, and also to see that in the hurt parts, or when we get triggered, or when we have relationship arguments, often that function collapses and then we feel more separate, or when we have arguments between groups in society or between different political fields in society, often this I feel you feeling me is not what we feel. And so in the gaps, all kinds of reenactments of trauma are happening, because when you feel felt, there's way less chance that you will reenact the trauma than when we are in a more distant, anonymous space together. And so I think that resonance that everyone knows from functional relationships, when it's there, it feels very soothing. It feels very good. We feel much calmer. We feel often when somebody listens to us 5 minutes with that quality, it feels like a relief. So we all can be on both ends of that function.
Nice, nice. It's one reason I always tell guests I take notes on my phone before I interview them, in case they think I'm, not paying attention. But any more on the book? So in terms of it, what would you say is like the main thrust of the book? Is it that we attune through bodies as social animals, and that's absolutely critical for communication, for peace, for intimacy? Like, what would you say is the main thrust of the book?
Yeah, that it's a basic function, but it's also the basic resource to heal trauma. So I think every good trauma therapist, like that's a key function that person needs to have, beside all the knowledge of trauma and how it influences us neurophysiologically and all the other parts. But I think having a warm relational space and presence where we can really feel with clients or groups, and we can hold a space together, that shared space, I think, is the basic function of trauma healing. And if somebody can provide that, it's great. And if therapists get triggered by the trauma of the client, and then they say, oh, this was a difficult client, then we see that it's not working, because the difficult client doesn't live over there, it lives in the therapist. And so when we see, oh, if I expand my capacity to hold space in different conversations, and then more and more also in different challenging conversations, when it's about racial healing, or when it's about other strong, or the Holocaust, for example, when this deep trauma comes up, to stay present and open and in a resonant capacity, that needs a lot of development. So, and that's why I think what the book says is that attunement is a basic function that is built into our nervous system naturally. It gets hurt through trauma, and it can be reestablished through healing, and it can be, for professionals, like, I think it's the main asset. Also, by the way, for leaders, teachers, everybody who works with people, I think, and everybody who is a parent or a partner.
I was going to ask you about leadership. Like, I was just in Hungary, and I have a couple of team members there, so I went out to meet them, and it's a pretty numb group of people. I mean, only Russia comes close in my experience, and I was with my colleague, and we are having lunch, and I was joking with her because she knows the work I do, but she's a technical person. I won't say her name, but I said, look, she was kind of paranoid that the food wasn't real meat and it wasn't cooked properly. And I saw like this paranoia or defensiveness, which of course comes from somewhere, like her ancestors have been through a lot. And we laughed about it, and we brought it to the surface, and she's done a couple of workshops with me, even though she's a technical person. So it was like something we're able to talk about. And I'm like, I mean, even to the point of, she gives me my marketing numbers and she tells me we're going to get 50 sales. I know we're going to get 75, because I know she's deeply pessimistic. like and we joke about that in the team. I say, these Hungarian numbers or Australian numbers? Because you've got an Aussie who's a lot more optimistic, you know? He's like, no worries, mate, we're gonna get 100. I'm like, okay, I'll be 75 then. So like even on a very practical level, I need to think about that as a manager. And just on the level of being kind, like I don't want to make these people's lives hard. Like a bad boss ruins people's day. And it's without trauma awareness and without the understanding of residents. Like she was like, why have you come all the way to Budapest to see me? I'm like, because we need to eat together and walk together and have a coffee in the New York cafe. And we need to breathe and touch and hug. And then it's easier when we're on Zoom afterwards, you know?
Mm, mm.
And I was on Zoom with her this morning and I said, it feels more real now, doesn't it, than a week ago? Because I hadn't seen her in well over a year. So I think for leaders, this stuff's critical, isn't it, to understand resonance.
Absolutely. I think for leaders, it's critical to understand relational resonance. For leaders, it's critical to understand that the ecosystem that they are able to create around themselves in terms of psychological safety, trust, clarity, honesty, transparency depends on their inner state of their own nervous system. It's also important to understand that the trauma of the leader, since it's often unconscious, will have systemic effects too. So our presence has systemic effects, our trauma also, as long as it's unconscious. So that we see, oh, wow, being more trauma informed as a leader is, I think, absolutely necessary. With all the knowledge that we have right now about trauma, it's not just like it's not just a big industry, it's also that it really has impacts, and the unconsciousness of leaders is having an impact on how companies are running, how people will feel, how many people burn out, or how sustainable and motivated people will feel. And just the example that you just brought, I think just such a moment of true relationship and true interest, and also a deeper understanding of certain patterns that are there, can create a deeper ground and is part of a developmental process. So it's a beautiful example. And you said it also, that Zoom will feel more close or more real and more connected, and other effects, just this one intervention. So there's a lot there. And also that we see organizations go through traumatic phases, like big layoffs, cost cuts, or scandals that happen. And most of the organizations don't have the skill set to really slow down for a moment and integrate what happened, and then move on and harvest the learning of that phase. So there's a lot there.
So as we move towards wrap up, a couple more, just two more questions. So you have this wonderful view of time, which it makes sense to me actually, that it's not just this linear thing, we're in the past and going to the future, that the future sort of speaks to us as much as the past. So yeah, what question does the future want me to ask you to complete this interview? I've got one more fun one after this deep mystical one.
I think, first of all, just to acknowledge that the future speaks to us, or the future has an influence, that causality, like when I kick a ball and the ball is rolling, that is clear to us. But how the retrocausal effect works, that's not so clear to us until maybe we deal with ancestral healing, or we deal with healing in general. And then we look at, wow, are we actually having an influence on the past? Are we actually influencing our grandparents when they were in bomb shelters? And are we maybe part of their resources that they had available to go through their crisis in a different way? So the question is, I think it's a good question. We don't need to say it is like that or is not like that, but to look at time a bit more open, and also to see that the future generations are potentiality that speaks to us right now, and innovation and creativity and being inspired by the future, like what I call often downloading the future, I think is a great skill. And I also think meditation techniques can create the inner space to connect to that more. And the same is also true for the past, because we often say innovation is how we download new technologies and build new apps and build new AI. Yeah, that's all great. but there is frozen innovation that's stuck in the permafrost of the trauma that's learning that we've never had. So if we don't integrate collective trauma, all the learning that is stuck in the ice is also not happening. And especially the ethical learning. Did we get the full ethical learning of how the Second World War could happen, how a Holocaust could happen, how enslavement happened? We don't have that ethical learning yet because we didn't want to go through the pain yet that has been created. So, but we need that ethical upgrade, for example, to build AI or nanotechnology or genetic engineering in a way that will not cause another cycle of trauma, but will actually be more aligned with our ethical maturity. So there's a lot there, I think, in thinking time more fluidly, and that the past is not just history, but the past is the history we never integrated.
Nice. Okay, fun one to finish. So a little birdie told me you liked fantasy role playing when you were a kid.
That's true.
I'm going to steal an idea from my friend Daniel Ingram, which is I want to do Thomas Hübl stats. So the way this works is like characters will have like out of 10, they'll have like strength 10, agility 5, leadership 7, or like top trumps is pretty similar if listeners have heard that. So what are Thomas Hübl's top 5 stat lines out of 10? Let's do it.
Mine, no, not
Yes.
the characters of my role playing.
Thomas Hübl, the
My,
level 9 trauma mage. What are his top 5 stats?
My top 5 stats. I think what are my top 5 stats? I think intuition, or I think attunement is actually one of my top 5. How to feel, how to feel people. Yeah, I think I have a very high level of attunement. I have a very high level of intuition about, like, when I work with people, especially in the work with clients or with groups. I think that these are my top stats. And I think I have a pretty deep, I practiced meditation for, I don't know, 30 some years, and I was 4 years on a meditation retreat. So the depth of stillness, to be still in myself, is definitely one of them.
Nice.
And I think I have a high stat to translate scientific principles and mystical principles into a dialogue. I think that's definitely one of my skills to take.
What's the Achilles heel? What's the bottom? What's the 0 out of 10?
The 0 out of 10. 0 out of 10. I don't know. See.
It's not dress sense. That's a nice shirt.
It's not dressing, no. I think, I don't know. A 0 out of 10, I don't know. But I think I'm not so much into competitive sports, or like I love sports, but I'm not so much into competitive sports and into all kinds of competition stuff. I don't think I ever engaged much in that. So maybe that's one of the lower scores.
Okay, next time I'm in town, I'll take you to the gym and we can bench press together or play a game of tennis or something. Thomas, it's been a pleasure, man. Where do people find you? Where do people go to find your stuff?
My website, I think Thomas Hübl, ThomasHUEBL.com, ThomasHübl.com. Then our Collective Trauma Summit is great. It's a free online summit every year with great speakers, collectivetraumasummit.com. And our NGO that does collective trauma work all over the world is pocketproject.org, pocketproject.org.
Great. Thomas, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.